Hi everyone, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to our latest TW webinar. My name is Patrick Tidwell. I'm a general practice partner with the firm at their Exeter and Tiverton offices, and it's my pleasure to be the host with the most, or probably the host with the least, for this afternoon. Obviously, everybody will be aware it's been another momentous week. We had Uncle Boris on Sunday addressing the nation, and it really, what that said to me was that it was kick-starting the return to work phase, certainly in England. And what we're badging it as at TW is life after lockdown, and what we're thinking of doing is a series of webinars on that subject over the forthcoming weeks. In this week's webinar, we'll be looking at a sort of us at TW as a case study and how we as a regional employer of 270 staff, 28 partners across 17 offices across Devon and Somerset, how all that works given the guidance that the government have given. And to explain this from our perspective, I'm delighted to welcome my boss, Managing Partner Shona Godefroy. It's fortuitous really having Shona on the call because two things really. First of all, she's actually read the guidance, so that's a great help. And secondly, as she's an Arsenal fan, she does have a high boredom threshold, so it's a win-win. Incidentally, I've seen the guidance as well, and for each of the 8 workplace studies that they've done, it's about 32 pages of PDF, so it's not actually too bad really. I'm also delighted to welcome our guest presenter, Jon Dunkley. Now, Jon is a partner with Wollens solicitors and heads up their employment law team. Jon and I co-hosted an event at Exeter Mercedes back in late February, and I don't know about you, Jon, but it does seem like an awfully long time ago, doesn't it, that one? Now, I'm really pleased again to have him on the call because, as you might be aware, a lot of these questions that we're receiving and the subject matter does lend itself to employment law. So it's great to have him along. It just means that Shona and I can sort of take more of a back seat, and we'll let Jon do all the heavy lifting, I think. And as ever, we have in the background our head of marketing, Jamie, and he's looking after the technology for this afternoon's webinar, and he's also recording it as well. So, and he'll be sending that to you attendees in an email after we've finished. So what's the plan this time for this afternoon? Well, I'll start with more from me, I'm afraid, just a quick overview of what's happened in the last week on the various different sort of government schemes out there. I'll then hand over to Shona for her take on the TW journey and the guidance the government's issued. And then it's over to Jon for his perspective on the various employment law issues from his and the questions his clients are asking. After which, and assuming we haven't attended to the questions during their presentations, we'll attend to the questions that are submitted when you registered. And also, if you haven't yet, don't worry, you can use the Q&A or the chat button down there and submit questions as we go. Please post anon if you'd like to remain anonymous, and do remember that really for Jon's benefit, we are sort of more general questions, specific questions about your specific circumstances we'll try and answer, but I can't really put Jon on the spot too much there. If you find at the end of the seminar that you haven't asked a question and you would still like to, you can email us at events@Thomas Westcott, or one word, .co.uk. We will attend to every question either on the webinar now or afterwards in the next few days. And if you're a client of TW, you're encouraged to put your partner down that you usually deal with, and he or she will probably get back to you. So that's the intros done. It's over to Patrick for his take on what's happened in the last week. So Patrick, over to you. Thank you, Patrick. Right, here we are. what's happened? A couple of stats, first of all, on the CBILS loans and the bounce back loans. Now, the stats for earlier this week showed that there had been 36,000 successful CBILS applications, drawing down just about £6 billion. So you think, well, okay, that's definitely an improvement on what had gone before. But the key stat is that in a lot less period of time, there have been 268,000 successful bounce back loan applications, drawing down over £8 billion. So it says to me two things, really. First of all, that the CBILS, it's starting to work, but hasn't really gained too much sort of momentum as yet, but it'll carry on. But the bounce back loans, and this you'll be aware is where the government guarantee 100%. So computer says yes rather than no. They've been very successful. What else have we had? The discretionary fund is what we've had. The government is starting to flesh out a few more details, and they've issued guidance to the local authorities that essentially these are grants where, for businesses who don't qualify for the rates grants, perhaps because they're a bed and breakfast paying council tax, or they're a business in a unit where they're paying a service charge perhaps rather than actual rates. So what have the government said? Well, they've said to the local authorities to essentially, they have got the discretion to pay, but they've got to put their conditions and their procedures on the local authority website. The grants that they can give are either £25,000, £10,000, and these mirror their business rate grants earlier. Or they can actually give a grant less than £10,000. So they've got to put that on their website. So my advice is check out the local authority website if you think you qualify, and actually contact your local authority too. The job retention scheme, that was the major sort of change in the week, in that the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, announced that it would be extended to October. So it's preventing, at least for the moment, this sort of cliff edge that commentators were worried about. The scheme will operate exactly as it is for the moment, up to the up to the end of July, rather. But from the 1st of August, two things happen. Firstly, although the government have kept the 80% stroke £2,500 kind of limits, they will fully expect employers to contribute to the 80% after the 1st of August. Quite the split, how that's done, we just don't yet know. More guidance on this, we gather, is going to be issued at the end of May. The other kind of development, though, with the JRS is that from the 1st of August, there'll be flexible furloughing part-time furloughing. So that will answer a lot of the questions that employers have had. Quite how it will, the mechanics of which will work, we don't quite know. We're waiting for more guidance on that. And then finally, on my little section, some more details on the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme, or SICE. Now, this week was the week where you could start making your claims. The idea is you check your eligibility using their online tool at HMRC, and they'll tell you when you can apply. So you apply. Unfortunately, I would remind everybody that you've got to do this through your government gateway. You can't use your agent to do this. But one major change, actually, is that for those of you who don't have a government gateway account or can't access the internet, there is a helpline number that HMRC have issued, which is 0800 024 1222. So again, that's a major concession for those who don't have the interweb or can't otherwise access a government gateway account. So that's a very quick run through from me on what's happened. I'd like to now sort of pass over to Shona for her sort of presentation. She does have a few PowerPoint slides, and she has been sort of slightly struggling with one screen at home there to sort of get them to load. So bear with us. So Shona, over to you. Thank you.
Hey, well, let's hope this works. So Just bear with me. I will get there.
Bear with.
Yes. There's. Right, hopefully everybody can see that. So good afternoon, everybody. I really just wanted to share with you the journey really that Thomas Westcott have been going through in the last 8 weeks, or 7 to 8 weeks, which is a journey and decisions I'm sure a number of you as businesses have also been taking. So where were we in respect of all those 8 weeks ago? Well, Thomas Westcott, we've got 17 offices across Devon and Somerset, as Patrick has said, with 270 team members. And about a week before lockdown, we decided to actually close those offices, but we were still very, very much open for business. And we knew lockdown was probably going to be coming, so that's why we took that decision. And we relocated our teams, and the majority of those were working from home. What has always been our mantra is by your side, on your side, for our clients, but we were just doing that remotely. IT was a challenge to start with. The majority of us have got laptops, but actually quite a significant number also had desktops, but those can move. And if there's one thing we're taking forward from this is that in the future, it's going to be laptops every time. Communication, which I'm actually going to talk about a little bit later, absolutely key. Communication with our clients, communication with our professional contacts, and communication with our teams as well. There were team members who could not work from home or who had other responsibilities. Suddenly we found that schools were closing. Actually, perhaps we had elderly relatives that needed to be looked after. And so we needed to adopt flexible working really, really quickly. But also we needed to think about, well, how were those team members, what was going to happen to those? So we put some guidelines, we started with some guidelines, and then government came up with a whole load of other guidance, including the job retention scheme. So that threw everything out of the window. And as Patrick has alluded to, I have read nearly every bit of guidance that's come out. So it's extremely time consuming, but so very important. So in respect of Thomas Westcott, there was our own team, which very much our management board were focusing on, and then there were our clients, and both equally important. So in respect of our teams, I've said about communication. What was really important is that we communicated with them, we let them know what was going on, and I hope we did as best a job as we could on this. And we continue to have weekly newsletters for our staff. We've embraced Zoom. We've never had so many Zoom meetings, and also WhatsApp groups. So whether they're working or come onto furlough, we keep in contact with them. Their well-being was so important to us, and remains to be very much in the forefront. In terms of well-being, this isn't just working from home, this is working in isolation. So they can't see their family, their colleagues, their friends. So well-being has been very important to us. But as I said, there were people that were actually, they couldn't work from home because their role is perhaps more administrative, and they didn't have such a client-facing role, and it just wasn't possible to do that role at home, or they had other responsibilities. So that's when furlough came into place. We have got some team members who are on furlough. So that has been consistently reviewed week on week, but we have actually dealt with that as well. And flexible working. We as a practice had a number of people working flexibly, but suddenly people working from home, as I said, those other responsibilities, we really needed to embrace flexible working. So you do your work, as long as you're still there for your clients at certain times in the day, then work as you need to, and just to get the job done. In respect of our clients, again, I'm saying communication's key. We have these webinars, we have weekly newsletters, and many other blogs, etc., going out via email and also on our website as well. The COVID-19 team, I knew that the management board were concentrating on what our practice was going to do, but we needed to look after our clients. And our COVID-19 team, as they've been named, have been fantastic at taking all that information from the government. And it's been so much, and there's been a lot more this week. And actually summarising that for our clients so that then they can understand that, and then assisting them with what did furlough mean for them, grant claims, what was available, there's loan applications, job retention scheme applications. So a lot of work to do there. But the next stage, so obviously, as Patrick said, we had Boris's announcement on Sunday, which seemed to have lots of confusion for some. But for us, it was quite clear that actually for businesses, if you can work from home, then you should continue to do so. Monday, there then came a whole raft of publications, and the one I've got up on screen is Working Safely During COVID-19. And this one is for offices and contact centres, which is what Thomas Westcott have obviously embraced, because we are an office setting. But there are 7 other guidances in respect of workplace settings. They're not done on sectors, they are done on settings. And if you've got a company or a business that is allowed to open for business, then these are very good frameworks in respect of what to comply with. And what do they include? And I have read them, and they may only be 32 pages, but it did actually take a very long time. The overriding part of it is a risk assessment. And this is a risk assessment which we've done at Thomas Westcott. And you can read for yourself what these actual guidelines set out, but they are a very, very good framework to comply with. In respect of the risk assessment, actually what they're asking for is if you've got over 50 employees, then you actually publicise that on your website. We haven't done that yet, but we will do so. In respect of our own risk assessment, as I said before, it very much, the government does say for us, or for every business, if you can work from home, and I appreciate that many of your businesses, you can't do that, but for us, we can. We might not really want to, some of us, we might prefer to go to the office, but actually we have proved that we can work effectively and we can work from home. So our risk assessment at a very high level is that we will continue to do so until the government guidance changes. What we will be doing is a continual risk assessment with our health and safety officer and team. And if you don't have a health and safety officer, I would encourage you to use your team in that risk assessment, because actually they need to be comfortable that if you are going into your workplace setting, they need to be comfortable that they feel happy and that they can return to work. We're then going to be doing, from a Thomas Westcott point of view, a full risk assessment of all of our offices, so that when we do return, and because we have to prepare for that return, because we won't be working from home forever, that we've got everything in place. And when you go back to that framework, it is a very, very useful thing to do. We're doing a constant review of our workloads in respect of also the number of our team that are on furlough. And as that work increases, more people have come back from furlough, and also they've come back to do specific pieces of work, and sometimes then gone back on furlough. So that is an option as well. As I said, also ongoing support to clients all the time. So, and more of that, and the more government guidance that comes out, then we're reviewing that all the time. I'd encourage every business to be doing a full financial impact review. You probably don't know the full impact on your businesses at the moment as it continues and progresses, but that is very, very key, and indeed something we can help with, but also something reassuringly we are actually doing ourselves. And then we're giving guidance. We've got staff popping into offices to check post and to get client records. And actually in time, we will be looking at having meetings with clients and attending clients' premises, full risk assessments to be done on all of those to keep our teams safe. From a Thomas Westcott point of view, we're also looking at holiday options. Funnily enough, not many people are taking a holiday at the moment, and therefore we're in our holiday, our actual financial year started on the 1st of May. We don't want everyone backing up their holiday to the very last minute. So just looking at what holiday options we have for our own teams as well. And throughout all of this, communication. I've said we communicate newsletter on Zoom, WhatsApp. The staff have a very delightful video from me every week. I'm sure they love it. But it's just keeping that communication going internally and externally. And then well-being. As I said before, it's just very, very important for as time progresses, and we're going to be continuing to work from home, and some people are in isolation and not seeing very many people, then it's really important for our teams. And I've just sort of ended that with a review of how we might work differently going forward. We'd always intended to do a very detailed review of flexible working and working from home options in 2020 anyway. This has brought that forward, and also we're looking at lots of other ways and thinking, well, will the office environment ever be the same again? That's probably a very whistle-stop tour through Thomas Westcott. There's lots of decisions, and you can't really summarise it all in 10 minutes. But just to give you a flavour of what Thomas Westcott have been going through, along with many of your other businesses, and also what we continue to go through. Over to you, Patrick.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Shona. Yeah, I'll pass over to Jon now. I mean, Jon, obviously you've got some stuff to say, but can you just start really by just explaining very briefly how the process has been at Wollens? Has Wollens followed a similar path to ourselves on this on the pandemic and what have you? So, Jon, over to you.
Yes, hello everybody, firstly. Lovely to see you all in some obscure way. Yeah, Wollens has been doing the same thing, where there's a core team in the office. I'm one of them, so I've been here every day, rather unusually. I'm not working from home at all. And then we have the majority of our solicitors will be working from home, occasionally coming to the office to do everything. So it's business as usual as far as we're concerned. Nothing has particularly changed, apart from the fact that we're finding other ways around people having to come into the office. So dealing with identification, signing documents, there's some few technicalities around that and some odd meetings in car parks occasionally, but we're managing to cope with that.
We won't ask about those.
Another time, Patrick.
Yeah, another time, yeah. Yeah, so if you'd like to, just to sort of carry on then with, you know, what
yes.
clients
absolutely
coming back and new at and stuff like this.
Okay, yeah, I'm an employment lawyer. I've been advising, as you can expect, a huge number of clients over the last few months, effectively since the furlough provisions were initially proposed. Now, it really is the Wild West of employment law, I'm afraid. It's normally we're used to having legislation put in place. We normally have drafts of that legislation. There's normally an implementation period. Here, everything's happening in reverse. So the general principle is that employment law still applies. The laws that we had before are still in place and still need to be enforced. And indeed, there were a number of new laws that came into effect on at the beginning of April, which have largely been ignored. For instance, there is now a requirement that all employees have to have contracts before they start work. Of course, normally that would have been a big issue for everybody at the moment, because everybody is furloughed, working from home and not recruiting. Then it's not been a significant consideration, but people need to be aware of these things, and they still need to keep up to date on general employment developments. So that's the first point. The furlough provisions are effectively the product of government policy. They're not the product of a sensibly implemented legal regime. And a lot of businesses have had to have planned on the basis of government policy announcements. Government policy announcements are not the law, they are broad statements, and there is much that they don't say. So it has been very difficult for employers and employees to know what their rights are and how to deal with employment issues. But we've done it. We have done it, and we're continuing to do it. It's slightly frustrating because some of the policy announcements that are made are then reversed retrospectively, and so we're having some peculiar situations to deal with. But gradually, over a period of time, the consensus is building, and now we know a little more. One of the big announcements in the last couple of days has been in relation to holiday pay. very little had been said in relation to furlough and holiday pay. As Patrick alluded to, the announcement was made a couple of days ago, and the government has now provided some guidance on whether people on furlough can take holiday pay and be paid at their normal rate of pay, and whether they can be required to take holiday pay. Now, from an employment law perspective, from an employer's perspective, if you've got people on furlough for potentially up to 8 months, they'll have accrued 8 months of holiday pay. If they then all take their holiday at the end of that period, then you are in deep trouble. So at Wollens, we have a situation where your holiday year is based upon your birthday. In many organisations, the holiday period is it might be Christmas to Christmas, or April to April, and so it will affect different businesses in different ways. But we now have some clear guidance, at least. It's not a statement of the law, but it's guidance which indicates that you certainly, according to the guidance, you can require employees to take holiday in certain circumstances. And generally, employers would have to give double the amount of notice compared to the holiday taken. So if they want an employee to take a week's holiday during the furlough period, they need to give them 2 weeks' notice. The rules on holiday pay, the law on holiday pay, does not sit comfortably with some of the guidance. So if holiday pay is a big issue, then you will need to get some advice on the guidance, and it will often depend upon also what it says in your contracts of employment as well. So whilst I would love to give a definitive statement of the law today, I can't absolutely do that. And as with many of the things I'm saying today, most employers will have to get advice on their specific circumstances, because even if similar businesses are doing, carrying out various processes, it doesn't mean to say it'll be right for your business.
Just before you sort of maybe go on,
Yes.
I've got a few questions on holiday pay and this and how it sort of interacts with furlough. So I think it's probably a good time to stick them in here now while you're on the topic. We've had a question about, well, if an employee is on furlough and they take holiday, does that sort of interrupt the 3 weeks, or is it sort of not counted as part of this 3 weeks minimum furlough period?
Yes. Well, according to the government, in their recent announcement, employees that are furloughed can take holiday, and the employer can still recover holiday pay. Now, they can only recover 80% through the furlough process, and that will often mean that employers will need to top up employees' pay by that further 20%. So whilst we have not had much of an uptake in holiday, when employees do take holiday, they do need to be paid more, is the general consensus. Now, in the early days of our advice, where employers were up against the wall and had to save every penny, we were able to put forward a proposal whereby employees accepted holiday pay at 80% and were paid at 80%, and the employer could recover it. That's still theoretically possible, all right? But I can't advise employers to do it without seeking careful advice, and there is a risk. But if you're absolutely up against the wall and you've got to minimise every payment out, there is a way that we can facilitate that with the least risk possible. But that's all I can say at that point, I think. And just on the subject of holiday and when, who has the control over when you can take it, I did hear that the employers can restrict somebody's holiday to the sort of 28 days. Now, firstly, is that right? Is that still the case, if it ever was? But also, we've had a couple of questions saying, well, it's a point you alluded to a little bit earlier, that over this furlough period, employees are accruing holiday leave. Now, when they take it, so we got sort of, can they take it, and when do they take it? And does the employer have kind of control over both of those? Yes, okay. So a number of questions there. Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, okay. To give proper advice on this, we would need to know what the contract said as well as the government guidance.
Right.
According to the government guidance, employers have a degree of control over this in terms of requiring employees to take holiday pay during furlough. Some will wish to do so, others will not. There are some logistical challenges with doing it if you've got a large workforce. So again, it needs careful consideration, but it seems that you can do that.
Okay.
If employees have accrued holiday and they are unable to take it within their holiday year, whatever that is, then they are entitled to carry that holiday over to the next holiday year. And indeed, possibly the following holiday year, but I would very much counsel against that. I would suggest it needs to be in the next year for other legal reasons, regardless of what the government says. And normally that holiday would need to be taken in the early stages of the next holiday year. So normally employers would have to strongly encourage employees to take holiday at an early time. Now, I'm hoping that we will have not missed all of the summer by the time we come out of holiday, and employers will want to take holiday then. But it is a bit of a logistical nightmare for large employers to try and get everybody to take their holiday pay. And employers generally have some degree of latitude as to requiring employers to take holiday. All right. Beyond that, in terms of the technical answers, they are based upon their particular facts. It's a bit difficult to generalise beyond that, I'm afraid.
Okay, so if we could leave that sort of question for the time being and move on to the rest of what you were going to say, that would be lovely.
Okay. No, that's absolutely fine. And feel free to jump in any time, Patrick. So one of the key questions, I want to get this in early, is in relation to notice pay and redundancy. Now, redundancy might form the basis of another webinar, I think, because it's too big a subject in its own right. But there is a question as to whether, if you are going to make people redundant and they are currently furloughed, whether you can recover their notice pay through the furlough scheme. All right. Now, a lot of the zero risk advice is don't do it, okay? But there is always a risk when you make people redundant anyway. So on the basis that you will probably have to take some risk, it is the general consensus amongst the majority of lawyers, but that's all I would say, that you probably can recover 80% of notice pay through the furlough scheme, all right, whilst it is in operation. Normally you have to pay notice pay at 100%, so you will probably have to top that up. Again, that's the subject of further advice. But it appears that employers that have to make redundancies at the end of the furlough period, because many of them will have to, let's be honest, as much as we might not want to, probably the majority of employees will have to make 1 or 2 redundancies at least. There is no reason in principle why those payments can't be made during the furlough period, so that some of them can be recovered. And if employers are making more than 20 or more redundancies, there is a collective process that has to go through in a minimum 30-day period. It can be as little as a minimum of 45. If you're making 100 plus redundancies, then employers need to consider that now, because otherwise they won't be able to take advantage of the furlough payment scheme. All right, so that's one point I definitely wanted to get across to people today. I don't want to be negative or doom and gloom, but if you've got to make redundancies to save the business, waiting till the last minute is not the right thing to do.
Can I just sort of step in again then? Sorry to interrupt your flow, obviously, but we've had a couple of questions on redundancy. We've had somebody sort of writing in, and it's complicated because it's 0 hours contracts as well. But this lady's saying, well, we've got a 0 hours worker put onto furlough, but we now think it's unlikely there'll be a job for her to come back to. At what point do we stop the furlough claim and obviously, I suppose, commence the redundancy kind of provisions.
Yeah.
Are there any kind of special considerations given that it's on 0 hours? So is that something you can answer, or what?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Now, again, there is no definitive piece of law that we can refer to, so I can only go on what I've been advising other employers. Again, a slight caveat: it depends upon contracts of employment, it depends upon some other factors, but generally speaking, my view is that you can start. Sorry, let me start again. There's no reason to make anybody redundant as such whilst the full furlough period is in place until the end of July. After July, employers are likely to have to make a contribution, so there will be a cost to employers. And at that point, they may be unwilling, particularly as cash flow might be a bit tight for some people then, to make payments they don't need to make. So with 0 hours workers, or very casual workers, not employees but workers, and there is a fine distinction which some people might not necessarily get from the outset, so got to be careful. But in those circumstances, you can often simply terminate their employment, normally give notice, to end at the end of July, which is the end of the furlough period where the employer does not need to contribute. And that would be the fair thing to do. And that gives a little bit of time. But let's say that you have a redundancy process and a collective redundancy process. You arguably need to include those people within that process. If you're making more than 20 people redundant within a 90-day process at any one establishment, then you'll potentially need to consider these people within the 20 staff that are leaving. There's some complicated rules on it. So it's not absolutely straightforward, but with a lot of small businesses, they will be able to simply not give any further work to 0 hours contracts, and there will be no liability at the end of the furlough period.
Thanks, John. Actually, on the 0 hours, we've had a question just come in from Peter Johnson. He's saying, John, could furloughing at 0 pay be an option that could be offered rather than redundancy? What are your views?
Right, for temporary workers, well,
yeah.
If you've got a genuine 0 hours casual temporary worker, whatever you want to call them, then you simply don't need to give them any work. If you don't give them any work, they don't get paid. And that's the whole basis of it. The risk is if you've got somebody you call a casual worker, but they're actually an employee, then you have a potential liability. But if they are a genuine 0 hours worker, and ideally they've got a contract to that effect, then you simply, it'd be good to notify them, you simply notify them that you don't have any work for them for a period of time, and they don't work and they don't get paid, and that should be the end of it.
Yeah. But if you're saying, if I understand you correctly, if you've got somebody who's normally working 40 hours a week, and then they, instead of making them redundant, you sort of offer them the 0 hours arrangement. It relates to another question we've had as well about, can you get people, your staff, to come back part-time rather than full-time? It's sort of variation of contract, I suppose, and
yes, okay. Yeah.
Be very careful on that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, if you've got a contract with an employee, it's probably easiest to start with that, then as an alternative to redundancy, you can, by agreement, agree that they will come back part-time on a completely different contract, or even possibly on a 0 hours basis. Now, a lot of people won't agree to come back on a 0 hour basis unless they have no choice. Sorry, I think my phone's doing something interesting now. Still with me? So it is what you can negotiate with your employees, but very often reduced hours, even sometimes for a fixed period of time or sometimes for a longer period of time, is entirely appropriate if they'll agree. And if they agree, you simply need to confirm that agreement in writing.
And just one last thing on the redundancy aspects, because I think that'll be worrying a lot of employers. Presumably they can start the redundancy process and consultations while their employee is on furlough. That obviously won't prejudice this "I can't do any work for my employer" kind of argument.
Yes, because there's no, unfortunately, firm argument in relation to that. I think that if you were acting cautiously and you wanted to invite an employee along to a redundancy consultation meeting, it would be best if you took them off furlough for a day or possibly for a few days whilst you consulted with them, and then put them back on furlough as long as they were furloughed then for a further 3 weeks. Okay. With collective redundancy, it's less clear. But again, we simply don't have answers to that. But it is something that employers will very carefully need to consider, because if they get it wrong, then they might be making not necessarily fraudulent claims, but incorrect claims to the revenue. And it's something that needs to be very carefully considered.
Thanks, John. What I'd like just to sort of go on to now is obviously the return to work and employees coming back off furlough. Whether they might be re-furloughed again is neither here nor there, but they're coming back. And I'd like to sort of put this to Shona, really, that if you've been on furlough for several months, Shona, what do you think will be the issues with the employees coming back? I mean, I know what I'm like when I come back to work on a Monday morning after the weekend, and it's like, so what do you think would be the issues from your view as to staff coming back?
I mean, we've already had some of our staff coming back from furlough, and I think the important bit is really whilst they're off furlough, and it is difficult, is to try and stay engaged, not with the work, because completely you cannot be doing any work while you're on furlough, so that's very, very clear. But actually we've got everyone's personal email addresses, so they're still getting our staff newsletter, still being invited to stay in contact. But obviously as that time progresses on, then there's more of an issue, but potentially more of a detachment from the firm. So in terms of when coming back now, it's really a case of having almost like a mini induction, inducting them back into the firm, what's been going on in that particular office, and then in the wider firm. Hopefully in the wider firm they get a picture anyway, but I think that's very, very important, because you say it's just sort of reintroducing them back to the business.
Thanks. And I know we're very lucky at TW to, we've got a health and safety chap, Kevin, and we can carry out these risk assessments. But a question's just been asked, and we've had the theme on the questions prior to the seminar, is that, and John, you might need to step in here, but what are where does the sort of power lie? If the employer and say TW are making every effort to make the environment safe, but then the employee says, no, I don't feel safe in this environment. Where do we stand on that? And
okay. Yeah, it's a very, I like to call them the reluctant returner. There are some people who are quite happy sat in their pants in the garden drinking all day and on 80%. Why would you want to do all of your work for 20% more pay? And I advise every day on this point, because people are bringing people back from furlough, and it's causing huge problems within workplaces. Again, unfortunately, each case depends upon its merits, but it's important that businesses decide what is required for the business. That's the starting point. If you need to get people back, then ultimately, unless they have a significant risk of a health issue, you can generally, and this is only generally because each case depends upon its merits, but you can generally require people to come back, provided you've got relevant health and safety precautions in place, protections, and if they don't, you can not pay them and indeed discipline them for not doing so, provided you've got all your ducks in a row and you've done everything correctly. If you haven't, and you bring people back, there's a huge risk. I mean, if I could just give you one example, let's say that you've got a reluctant employee that you require to come back. You've said you've got all of the health and safety provisions in place. they come back and then they immediately contract COVID-19 and claim that it is from somebody in the workplace, they could become seriously ill from that and they could die. And these are very serious consequences. If it was proven that somebody had died as a result of inappropriate risk assessments within the workplace, which enabled them to contract it, there's a significant personal injury claim there. Now, whilst that is of a worry, employers that do this sensibly and properly are at much lower risk, and many employers, well, all employers should be insured should they have taken the proper risk. So I would encourage people to put in place proper risk assessments, but then possibly have a quick word with their insurers just to make sure that if there are some consequences, that at least they are protected as best as they can be.
Thanks, John. We just have one question about the health and safety equipment that you might need to install in your premises. And we had a look at this before, and we're saying, well, we're not aware of any specific grants for, to have maybe your plastic shielding and this sort of thing. But obviously it would be tax deductible. If it's more in the way of screens and barriers and things, it's more plant and equipment, so you'd claim 100% annual investment allowance on that. If it's things like tape and hand gel and this sort of thing, then that would just go through the profit and loss account and you get 100% tax relief on that. But we're not aware of any specific grants for the provision of this sort of gear. It's at the employer's expense. If that does change, or we find that something has changed like that, we'll let you know. But finally, I'm conscious of time, but it's such a sort of fertile ground here, isn't it? We've had a few questions on the fact that obviously pay scales, and again, this one might be for you, John, in that obviously originally it was furloughing is based on February and this sort of thing, but pay rates are now, we've had a question. Well, we've agreed with the union that the pay scales are going up. So does that increase your furloughing claim? Obviously, it could be subject to abuse, couldn't it? But what are your thoughts?
Yes, I have thought about it. I don't really have a definitive answer. I'd have to consider it in context. Essentially, the furlough scheme is based upon current pay, as far as I'm aware, unless you're going to tell me otherwise, Patrick. And I can't think that you would be able to apply retrospective pay scales, but it is quite a complicated concept. It depends upon how much, whether an individual is contractually entitled to that pay at that time, even if they haven't paid it. And it's quite a complex process. It's not one for today, I don't think, Patrick, really. No. It's one which I think we would need to look into very carefully in the context of the individual business, I'm afraid.
Okay. I think one sort of final kind of question here, and I don't know if you can take a view on this as well, Shona, is that we've got a question saying, well, if somebody is in a customer-facing role and they're in a vulnerable group, or they are coming back from furlough potentially, but they are vulnerable themselves. I mean, first of all, what would we do at Thomas Westcott in that situation, Shona?
Well, I think if they're in a vulnerable group at the moment, then we wouldn't be encouraging them. And if they're concerned about coming back to work, then we wouldn't be encouraging them to do it. I mean, if obviously they can do their work from home, then that's slightly different. But we wouldn't be encouraging that, and we would keep those particular people on furlough. And that is an option for the period to come. John, have you got anything to add to that from an employment law perception?
No, not particularly. I think I agree with everything you said on that point. It all seems entirely appropriate. Sorry, I've
put another 50p in the meter.
Distracting noise.
Okay. I think that'll probably do it for now. Actually, we've covered a lot of ground here. Again, what I would say is that if we haven't answered your question or you don't feel we have, please do email us at events@thomaswestcott.co.uk. We will attend to every question we get, and if you if you have another question, please do so. We'll attend to those. and we'll pass ones over to Jon as appropriate. Our next webinar is planned for next week, either Thursday or Friday. It'll be more from a dispute resolution slant, we're thinking. So where you should, if you're a business, how should you be resolving your commercial disputes rather than just taking people to court? So do look out for that one. That promises to be really good. And finally, I'd like just to thank Shona and Jon for their kind of contributions today. I hope you, the attendee, have found that sort of interesting. Certainly, we've had quite a few questions. So finally, I'd just like to thank you for attending. Have a great weekend, and channeling my inner sort of Ron Burgundy, stay safe, Devon and Somerset. So thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you.